I'm a statesman stating statements and statuses like radishes pull requests can't half of this. Full of state, half empty skull grub plate. Pack that gam up on my cam, I'm so modern you can call me Tate. 4 minds, 4 countries in the heavy 2020. We won't be rate the state of state when we share our good and plenty. We got Rosemary, Lili, Tomasz, and Jacquie rolling steady. Alpha, beta, keep that data always flowing on Kubernetes. Ah. Welcome everybody to the Data on Kubernetes meetup. Super excited to be here today in the middle. Well, we're getting started with KubeCon, so there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of cool ideas that are going around. My name is Bart. I'm taking over for Demetrius. Demetrius wasn't feeling so hot today, so I have the chance to run the show on my own. And anyway, got a bunch of different things we want to talk about. But before we get started, just to let everyone know, we always want everyone to know all the folks out there that have interests or ideas, concepts that they want to share, anything related to data on Kubernetes. We have our Slack. We've got around 250 people in there now. We've grown a lot since July. We also are on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter. We're really excited to get all the different ideas from all the folks out there. Just in this group, we have a really cool mix of different people from different countries. We have the United States. We have Canada. We have Slovenia by way of Berlin, we have Poland, and we have Northern California by way of Bilbao in the Basque Country, all right? So this is pretty cool, this is exciting. I don't know if a meeting with this exact mixing and matching has happened before, but like I said, we definitely want to invite everyone to get it on our Slack. We also have podcasts, we're starting to make animated videos with metaphors, different people's ideas. Another thing that I want to announce today that we're super excited about is that we are starting to collaborate with an NGO that's also in KubeCon, which is Code 2040. Which is helping Black and Latinx folks get better access to code training in the United States. They have a really good plan for the next few years to get a lot more folks from diverse backgrounds into programming. So there will be a $100 donation being made dedicated to our wonderful panelists. So that will be on Twitter, so look out for that soon. We also have t-shirts. If anybody wants a t-shirt, although logistics are kind of interesting right now with 2020 and the COVID situation, we can get a t-shirt anywhere in the world. So just feel free to reach out and message me on Slack. That being said, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have a rock star lineup. I haven't been able to interview such an awesome panel yet since I've been involved in the Data on Kubernetes community. But we have Tomasz from Poland. Tomasz, could you just introduce yourself and explain how you got into this whole world of Kubernetes, particularly the issue of data on Kubernetes. And you recently wrote an article as well on the challenges of stateful versus running stateless applications. So could you just introduce yourselves to everyone and let them know who you are?
Okay. Hi. I'm Tomasz or Tomasz if you prefer. So I'm a co-founder of Cloud Corp Labs, but I'm also a cloud native enthusiast. And I write sometimes, occasionally, some articles that you can find on our page or on my own blog. And basically, I've been working with Kubernetes for over 5 years now, so almost from the beginning. And I'm helping companies to implement this cloud native approach, basically. Yeah. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. It's always interesting when we get the difference, different amount of years that people have been spending. It's always a little bit wishy-washy if someone says, and I've been working on Kubernetes for 12 years, but obviously that's not your case. Anyway, thank you very much for being here. Lili, how about you?
Sure. I'm Lili. I work at Red Hat currently, and I'm just a software engineer, and I've been working with Kubernetes. I actually think about it for like 4 years or so. So currently my position is around monitoring and observability, and I'm the maintainer of Prometheus operator, which is why I was invited mainly to discuss the Prometheus statefulness.
Very good. We will definitely be looking at Prometheus. Cool. Next, Jacquie, how about you?
So I'm not going to lie, I had to look at my LinkedIn to see which job it was I started doing Kubernetes in, because what is time? But I started doing it 3 years ago. I currently work as a developer advocate at Hashicorp, and I work with Nomad, which is the orchestration tool we have. And prior to this, I got into Kubernetes actually at a digital healthcare company. So it's fun stories there, but we can get into those after.
Very good. Like you said, very diverse LinkedIn. Sometimes you have to know which hat am I going to wear today, which thing am I going to take. Good stuff. And Rosemary, what about yourself?
I'm Rosemary Wang. I'm a developer advocate at Hashicorp as well. I have been working with Kubernetes for about 4 years. I fell into it because I was a consultant and a client really wanted to use it. So I had to learn it in probably 2 or 3 weeks. And the difficult part was that I actually had to deploy Console and Vault on Kubernetes before there was any support for it. And so I went down this really big rabbit hole of stateful sets, operators, and PVCs. And it was just this really amazing thing to me. So I fell into it because of a very practical purpose.
Very, very good. Rosemary, well, can we stick with you for 1 second? I was listening, every time we do these, I always try to do my homework and watch videos or listen to podcasts of the folks that are going to be on the program with us. And in your case, listening to a couple of interviews, you talked about your background as a DevOps. And saying that term is, relatively slippery sometimes. What is a DevOps? What is not a DevOps? We got DevSecOps, we've got AI ops, we've got all these different kinds that you added ops onto anything, and gives it a little bit of an extra edge. With the same thing, I often find a slippery sort of sensation when talking about cloud native. And also I was talking to Tomasz's colleague, Jacquie, about this, is that when people say cloud native, what is it that we're really trying to say, particularly within this context of KubeCon? Could you, give us a 2 or 3 sentence or a short summary about, for you, what it means for something to be cloud native, what it means to be cloud native? So imagining that, when we have to talk to people that are outside the community and you say, well, there's this thing called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And look at you like, yeah. So how do you approach that? How do you frame it?
So my definition of cloud native, or my thoughts about cloud native, came pre-Kubernetes because I did a lot of other container orchestrator stuff. And I also had to manage a private cloud. So what it effectively meant to me when I was teaching people the term cloud native meant that you could self-service, you were empowered to do things for any kind of resource you wanted to. Infrastructure is basically this definition of whatever your application needs to be supported. It could be metrics, it could be queues, it could be servers. So any of those things that you could self-service effectively became cloud. And to be able to use it within your applications, to use it within even data processing, meant that you had to change the way that things were written, the way that things were structured. So that inherently meant being cloud native. Can you run in this ecosystem of self-service resources?
That's great. And I think a lot of times as well, too, something that I like to touch on a lot in our community is that as much as we have obviously very strong technical profiles, and this panel is no exception, sometimes, or I always think there's always a cultural element that goes along in this. And that as you said, is that, yes, we can talk about technical things, but we're really talking about a mindset and approach. Lili, since you've been working with Kubernetes for a while, and do you share the same thoughts as Rosemary regarding cloud native, or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, the cultural aspect is so important. Like convincing people or getting them to be in that right mindset makes it so much easier to explain the concepts and the terms and the technologies we use and why it's so important. So I definitely agree with Rosemary. Yeah.
Very, very good. Now, Jacquie, thinking about KubeCon right now, we've got an interesting situation in the world. We're doing everything virtually. We're doing everything digitally. For someone in your role with, working as a developer advocate, working directly with all different kinds of folks from all different kinds of countries, how do you see the importance of KubeCon going on right now and what it's delivering to the world in the community sense?
Ooh, that's specific. So I'm going to start with my first KubeCon was last year, and I went as a DevOps engineer. So kind of going to that and seeing this like 12,000 person keynote is completely crazy. And then coming to this side of it where I'm not a DevOps engineer I was actually going to learn about state specifically last year. There was some problems we were running into that I want to figure out. Seeing everything continuing on one hand, I think brings like a sense of consistency and stability, and like it's easy to kind of feel really isolated with everything going on right now. And previously I felt pretty isolated trying to learn these things on my own anyway. So I think having the conference still go on at least continues to provide a place for people to learn and network, even if we're adapting to figure out what that is like. I forget if there's a second half to that question. I'm so sorry.
No. I think that's a really, really
Okay.
good point. No, I think it's a great point though too. Is that for a lot of folks out there that have maybe a difficult entry point, and obviously a physical event where you can go around and meet lots of people and visit stands and booths, etc., is really, really good. I think at the same time, I think all the organizers have done a really, really good job of there's tons of conversations going on right now in Slack. I don't know how many Slacks you've written today, but I've definitely written more than a couple. And like you said, a lot of, I think what this is about is people trying to solve problems in a common way, sharing ideas, being open, being willing to give a hand. And Tomasz, maybe you can comment a little bit about that in your experience on a local level in Poland, from a community perspective. What are the things that you're working on in your community?
Well, basically, we're trying to convince people that the way that they worked previously, like with virtual machines, it's no longer viable. It's no longer valid for requirements of modern workloads, of modern software. So basically, we are trying to convince them that it's time to move on. It's time to start using containers, even for stateful applications. So even when what is really important, even if you can't use cloud, if you for some reason you are forbidden to use cloud, for example, one of the most prominent examples is, for example, financial services. So even if you can't use public cloud, you can always use modern cloud native approach with Kubernetes and containers.
Very, very good. Lili, what would you like to add to that? Just from the basic, thing that we encounter a lot is that people say, just go stateless. Don't get involved in the data, keep the data out of it. If you bring the data in there, we're going to have problems. How do you approach that? A lot of times when we talk to people, we'll say there's a trade-off, could be a performance trade-off, a cost trade-off. How do you see that?
I think I see it from more of a learning thing. Like, I feel like people need to learn a new approach rather. As is with any other technology, right? Kubernetes doesn't make it any special or magical. But what it does is it does provide ways and tooling around it that do give you an abstraction layer. You still need the experience in running a database, right? Like you would in any other system. There is nothing magical Kubernetes does there. But there's also nothing to be afraid of, I think. I think that's the misconception, I feel. The only thing is, just make sure that you have the administrators that can run stateful sets, whether stateful services, whether they're on Kubernetes or anywhere else, really.
So we can say the only fear we have that we should have is a fear itself.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that don't worry about it, because I think a lot of times it gets so overwhelming for people.
Yes, definitely.
Like, I don't want to get involved in this. Now, good. Can we turn it over to you, Rosemary? Can you fill us a little bit in about Vault?
Yeah. So Vault's interesting because you're storing sensitive information in an entity that is now hosted on Kubernetes that, is made to be multi-tenant, right? So it was really funny. For a long time, everybody was asking me, should I do it? Should I put Vault on Kubernetes? Because it's multi-tenant, because can I secure it? My secrets are encrypted. Are they encrypted? Are they not encrypted? Is there a management overhead to putting such a complex system like Vault that is very, very, very sensitive on Kubernetes? And the answer is yes, but with caveats, right? There's a whole list of recommendations. But Vault on Kubernetes is a really interesting case because, Vault itself was built to be on a distributed system. The way that it was architected was actually very much meant to kind of divide the content of the data from the actual control of how it's moving, of its transmission. It had to be built that way. It's moving secrets around. So the way that Vault works in Kubernetes is you can choose your storage option. Previously, in the past, you had to do it separately. So you would put it in console somewhere. You would put it maybe in a bucket somewhere. Now there's an integrated storage capability, which means you store that information in memory. And that provided, it was a whole host of questions, availability, right? Can you gain consensus? Is there consistency? Because it's not going to be great if you have a secret that doesn't work. So many questions there, many questions about state. And it wasn't until recently that Vault itself was architected to be able to do that, right? So for the long time, it was meant to be stateless in that it was deferring all the storage somewhere else. Now it's becoming, after Vault 1.4, now it's becoming more integrated in there. And that information is encrypted by Vault itself. So it's gotten better. I think it's also gotten easier to run it on Kubernetes as well.
Very, very good. Now switching over to Jacquie, because obviously working in developer advocacy as well. From listening to an interview of yours a couple of days ago, you were talking about how while you are in the dev advocacy teams, that you're then also rotating around to other teams to see how things are going on inside there, whether it's Vault or other things that are going on in Hashicorp. How do you I'm just curious about the way in which you get feedback from people that are working with these things. So then okay, Vault is working, but maybe from a user experience perspective or from a developer experience perspective, what are the things that maybe need to be tweaked or fine-tuned? How does that process work in Hashicorp?
I think there's a bit of flexibility on how we do it, depending on which product team you're working on. So as developer advocates, we tend to focus on 1 or 2 products that we work most closely with. In my case, that feedback comes from, sometimes it's talks and having like questions and answers. I tend to look a lot in the Hangout Slack and my local DevOps Toronto Slack. There's usually lots of discussion going on there, and I try and bring that feedback as well. And then I also sometimes will do like kind of meetings with different people using our products, whether they're practitioners or they're companies that are stuck on problems, or maybe they want to share something really cool they've done. I found those have been like the coolest because they take time to like walk through their tech stack and show us how it's working and everything. And then the final one is we also have like an internal team that's like our SRE team and our cloud infrastructure team, and they use all of our products as well. So kind of being able to get that feedback, but then also kind of poke in somebody's repository and see like, what are you actually doing with it? Which I can't do as much as a developer advocate. That's been really nice. And we're still ironing out on like my teams, at least, how we bring that feedback back and then use it. But we have the channels through community as well as like our clients and customers and just different areas. And there's a lot of answers to this. We also have like a discuss forum where we have posts that we interact with and GitHub issues. All these kind of contribute into that. Yeah.
No, it's great because once again, going back to this common theme of we have the technical side, but then there's got to be a human side. We've got to be seeing how are folks reacting to this? What are the things they're going to say about it? Are we using our social listening to map out what are the reactions that people have in order to make improvements? Now, on more from an outsider's perspective, we could say, from talking to Tomasz, he is a fan of Hashicorp and has quite a bit of experience. From your experience, Tomasz, whether it's with Nomad, whether it's with Vault, whether it's with Console, what has your experience been, particularly when we're talking about this issue of running stateful applications?
Using Hashicorp products, or I'm mostly a fan of 2 of your solutions, like you Hashicorp. First of all, Terraform, which is basically doesn't involve any states. Actually, it does, but with some recent features, it can store states inside Kubernetes. But Vault is, for me, it's kind of game changer when it comes to security, and this is one of my favorite projects, favorite tools that I recommend to everyone who wants to do it more in a more secure way. So basically, this is something that I really enjoy working with, and of course many people also use Console, for example, which is also very fancy tool, especially with Console Connect features. So I really enjoy, having a different approach to service mesh. So like service mesh with Console Connect, it is for me is much easier to achieve than with Istio. And obviously I am a fanboy, so I won't pretend that I'm not. So
easy audience. That's good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Lili, now to move it over towards you, can we talk a little bit about the differences between Prometheus and Vault? Some of the people in the community were telling me, hey, since Lili's got a lot of experience with Prometheus, maybe we can see a little bit comparing and contrasting side by side.
Sure. I mean, Prometheus is a monitoring tool, so in that regard, it can be compared one-to-one, I guess, to Vault. But I guess from a storing perspective, maybe like Prometheus doesn't do data replication because your monitoring system shouldn't be a distributed system, so it doesn't do data replication. But if you want things like long-term storage, you can either have it on your cluster with a persistent volume claim, or you can send it to via remote write to like a Tomasz receive or something like that. So in that regard, that's how you could sort of have like a Vault like thing. But yeah, it's hard to compare the two actually.
When you said about data replication, that's actually something that's come up a lot and actually came up last week as well. And talking about that and also issues of portability. And is there anything that you've noticed recently regarding those issues or problems that you may have encountered?
So in terms of data replication, we haven't had any specific problems regards to that. I think since like the Prometheus operator, which is what we use to run Prometheus on Kubernetes, it's quite resilient. It's one of the first operators that was created back in the day of CoreOS, and it has a lot of battle testing, and we have quite a lot of, like, we mainly had some problems around persistent volume claims in Kubernetes, as there were some breaking changes, but in regards to that, it's just like any other stateful application on Kubernetes, essentially.
Right, sorry. Very, very good. Also with that in mind, something that came up last week, all right, we would obviously probably have to show everyone the video, because also what Tomasz was mentioning is that Jacquie, the CTO of Meyer Data, was mentioning how there is no such thing as stateless, right? Obviously putting things in a certain context. I want to know, Lili, is there anything that just based on that reflection, what would you say to that?
That there's nothing stateless.
There is no such thing as stateless.
Yeah, I mean, everything needs to keep some sort of a state, right? Otherwise, what are, like, maybe a cron job can be stateless, right? If you have it for a second, but like there's definitely, in terms of like, if you use GitOps or something like that, you might have to keep your state in GitHub and not in Kubernetes, but in reality, yeah, definitely, I agree.
Okay. Good. All right. So we have someone in agreement with Jeffrey's very controversial statement last week. Another thing that came up in that conversation too, as well, was the issue of resilience. All right, the issue of resilience. We talked about this about in testing things, because as in an interview with Gary from Cloudian said, in general, data should not be moved. If it starts to be moved, there's risk of things getting broken. We have risk of having problems. How do you approach that, Lili?
Yeah, so I think for specifically, if we look at Prometheus, like if you have, I don't know, a faulty file system, or there's something goes wrong with the vol replay, those kind of things that we encountered, usually you get the snapshot and you try to spin up a new Prometheus and essentially go from that data. But yeah, I think having remote write in terms of Prometheus to send to a Tomasz receive, for example, or Cortex, or whatever you choose, I think is the best way of ensuring that you have long-term storage. But yeah, making replications and those kind of things make total sense, I think.
Very good. Now, for either one of the folks from Hashicorp, regarding running stateful on Nomad, either Rosemary or Jacquie, could you take that question?
Sure.
Challenges, advantages, things that you've noticed, things that folks are mentioning.
Oh, that's a very big scope. I mean, so we have a couple different ways of running stateful workloads. There's like Kubernetes has like PVCs and stateful sets, and I haven't worked with Kubernetes as much recently, so we're hoping it all stays together. But with Nomad, you have different types. We have like the host volumes, and then more recently, we've also implemented features for CSI, support for CSI. I think around some of the challenges we've ran into with that would be, we do have CSI available, but sometimes the actual drivers themselves are written in a very Kubernetes specific manner. So not all CSI works yet. And that's something we've been working on trying to figure out. I haven't really been able to do like larger scale state to give a more in-depth answer in terms of what I've found for challenges in the two of them versus each other yet. But yeah, it's like it's been interesting.
Good. Rosemary, anything you'd like to add?
There was a Nomad engineer, Danny Lancashire, who explained a little bit of the nuances and the difficulties in running, just generally, in running stateful workloads on container orchestrators. It doesn't matter which one you're doing, but they all have an interesting general set of patterns. I highly recommend it. I think it was at O'Reilly Velocity last year. But what's been really fascinating is how many of the patterns across many of these orchestrators you start to borrow, you start to understand even the ways that you handle it, right? Because they're all open source, you start to develop very similar patterns for how you handle state because they're all borrowing from each other. And it's all for the better good, right? We don't want to have a problem where we lose all our data. And so we all have this really interesting exchange of patterns and approaches and challenges that we're all commonly working toward.
Very good. And since you sourced somebody from Hashicorp as well, I would like to source a friend of mine, Tom Harvey, who I had the pleasure of working with in the same company about 3 years ago, who's now an engineer at Hashicorp. And he told me to ask, or just to throw this out there, right, the issue of handling data across availability zones. Anybody. Rosemary, we can start with you, or we can easily pass this on to anybody else.
I mean, I could start with that. I think it will heavily depend on the system and how it's built, right? So, sorry, there's like an awkward sun coming here. I should have shut the blinds.
It's a nice dramatic effect. Don't worry, it's good.
Thank you for a very difficult discussion. But I think what's interesting is it will depend on the tool. So and not to say that anything is bad or worse, but just some of the ways that tools are created often inform how they are handled across availability zones. So if you've got something, and this is very specific, but if you've got something like Apache Solr that is being backed by etcd, for example, and you're not using the etcd operator, you have to make decisions about how these things are deployed. If you've got nodes across multiple availability zones, you have to ask the question whether or not etcd, or put in the blank here, something that holds that state will actually work across multiple availability zones. And the answer is some tools will, some tools won't. Consul, Vault, for example, don't really care about the availability zone much. They're all clients that communicate to the server. So as you know, and even the servers themselves are also not terribly aware of what availability zones they're in. Yes, there are latency concerns, but the tools themselves are built in a way to be able to achieve consensus based on that information. So sadly, it will depend on the tool, but most of them now are fairly agnostic to availability zone, with some exceptions.
I think that's really good. And as you rightly mentioned, sometimes the tool thing, I always give this example, but tool battles can get really, really heated. Tom can tell you about when we were working in the same company. I always mention this, but World War III almost started because of whether we were going to use TeamCity or Jenkins. It got really ugly. Some people threatened to leave the company. But like you said, is it really a question of good or bad? They're just trade-offs. There are pros and cons. Every tool is going to have some strong points or weak points. It just kind of depends where you're at. To take that further in talking about operators, all right? So something that came up in our discussion with Patrick from DataStax, this question is for you, Lili, and then I also want to hear from Tomasz, is how operators, historically speaking, we're not talking about very necessary decades of history, but are designed to resolve specific problems. But Patrick was suggesting that eventually there could either be one operator to rule them all, to paraphrase The Lord of the Rings, or that operators, through self-learning and things like that, would sort of break away the need for having niche operators and rather just having, I guess we could say, a mothership. Lili, what do you think about that?
I disagree to some point because I think that you need to, like, operators to me, and I worked on many of them, have to be encompassing the knowledge of the person who is an expert in that technology, right? As well as an expert in Kubernetes. And I think those two people, like that one person or many people, are actually the ones that can actually write the operators that are resilient, are battle tested, as the case with like etcd operator, the Postgres operator from Zalando, or the Prometheus operator. And I think that it makes more sense to have many of them. It makes sense to maybe have one that manages them, but like in the case of OLM or something like that. But it makes sense to have many because there's no combination you will always have in every company, right? Not every company will go with Prometheus, or not every company will go with having their own etcd for other specific cases. Like that, you need to bring your own essentially. But yeah, that's my opinion at least.
Great point. I think, and we saw that with a conversation we had with Alexander, who works in Zalando and is with the Postgres operator.
Yes.
And so, and the thing is that the challenges that his company is facing are going to be different from other companies.
Definitely.
I think there is a lot to be said for tailoring operators to solve certain problems. I think that's a really, really good point. But often, like I said, whether it's questions like, is there no such thing as stateless, or will there be one operator? We always want to get these futuristic questions and ideas in there too. Tomasz, could you tell us about your experience working with operators?
Well, to be honest, I think that operators are the future of Kubernetes because they are building blocks of something bigger than just Kubernetes being a container orchestrator engine. No, it's something more. Kubernetes is becoming a platform for building platforms. And when you want to build a platform, you're building a platform using operators. And of course, I wouldn't encourage anyone to create their own operator for some application, but definitely for services such as databases or anything that is stateful. It is, for me, it's mandatory to use operators because, using Helm, for example, is just too simple. Operators, as Lili mentioned, they give you something more because they embed some complex logic behind, not only, making sure that you have a fixed number of replicas running, but also about upgrading, about some disaster recovery that is ongoing in the background. So this is actually one of the most important part of Kubernetes as I see right now.
That's good. And that actually ties very nicely into another question from my friend Tom, who works at Hashicorp, is about how to quickly handle backup or restoration for disaster recovery. Could Rosemary or Jacquie, could either of you tackle that question?
Jacquie, you want me to?
Yes. I mean, I can touch on it quickly in terms of, I don't know if there's an easy or quick way to handle backup and restoration for DR. The last time I worked with Kubernetes and I had a DR situation come up, we spent weeks planning it out. We didn't have a lot of data. Like we had enough data and enough timeline that we could actually back it up and move it to another cluster and take that short amount of downtime as long as we pre-planned everything else around it. And it went smoothly and we were so sure we did it right. And then it turns out that one of our pods that was doing our, I think our event queuing somehow got dirtied with the one that was in a totally different region and we never figured out how. So it's just, I'm not really sure if there is an easy way, but I'd love to hear Rosemary's further thoughts on that.
Let's do it.
Oh gosh. So I'm going to borrow this. So I borrowed this and I realized this weird thought. So I wrote, end of last year, there was an experiment to basically create an operator for Terraform Cloud, which is the SaaS offering for Terraform. The reason why is because it's well-scoped behavior. Too many people use Terraform 200 different ways. It's really hard to write an operator for it. So we scoped it just to Terraform Cloud. And what was really interesting was that there was on Kubernetes, I don't really think of it as a backup and restore. It's sort of like a backup and put it in a new resource, right? And then it's this interesting kind of blue-green approach that's not fully a backup and restore in the traditional sense. So if you're, even if it's a console cluster, a vault cluster, if all else fails, you just create a new one and you snapshot the old one and, and basically flip it to the new instance. That's effectively how a number of the operator commands have started to be constructed, not the Kubernetes operators, but even operator workflows for applications or workloads running on container orchestrators in general have started to offer these snapshot capabilities where you take that snapshot and you layer it onto a completely new instance. So I don't know if, I think the common pattern now is not a backup and restore, but backup and put to a new resource of some kind. And that's a much different pattern than traditional DR, which is you have this passive resource available, and then, you know, you keep it for all eternity, hope it is the same, roughly the same as what you have as your active resource, and you try to do it. So I think it's a little bit different now.
Great. Lili, do you have any war stories, horror stories about disaster recovery that you'd like to share?
No, I think I agree with what Rosemary said. I think that you just need to, it really depends on the component or service that you're actually recovering from, right? Whether it's a database or Prometheus or anything like that. And I agree completely that it's just a bit different mindset, but everything else is more or less the same as across all container orchestrators.
Good. Tomasz, anything to add before we move to the next question?
Well, yeah, so I agree with Rosemary that it's similar to this pets versus cattle, you know. So with Kubernetes, although we for stateful workloads, we do need storage, we kind of we need to change our mindset when it comes to recovery. So, and always when I'm showing, you know, some people or customers or some people that it's so easy, you know, to destroy some pod, some working container, even with database, and it can automatically, you know, it can be recovered automatically by Kubernetes itself. They are just amazed. They don't know that it is possible, and it's so very, very easy.
Very good. Tomasz, we're going to continue with you for the next question. All right. What are the advantages, and we can also say disadvantages, of deploying a stateful app versus a SaaS service on a cloud provider? Well,
like I mentioned, if you can use cloud, then of course it is, you know, it is very easy to use SaaS solution. And to be honest, whenever someone asks me whether to use database as a service, I always reply that, yeah, if you can, just use, for example, database as a service. And but to be honest, many organizations just can't go with cloud services, and that's why, you know, you will end up with some operator, or maybe you will just start experimenting on your own. But I would definitely, you know, recommend launching an operator for your database cluster. So basically, if you can, of course, SaaS services are quite cheap. But in some cases, for example, if you have like large cluster and you can spend some resources on experimenting, it is also very easy to, you know, to use operators to spawn multiple clusters, like for some on-demand test environment and so on, which can be not only cheap but also very, very fast.
All right, Lili, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it depends on your budget, your situation, and the amount of people you have, right? Whether you're running on Kubernetes or any other tool, like, you need to know that there will need to be a dedicated team to be SREing this, and that team needs to know that database or whatever stateful application you're running. So I think it makes sense in the beginning when you're spinning up, or even later. Some companies choose to just focus their time on production and their applications, like their production applications, versus running their database, and give those to SaaS providers. And that's just perfectly fine. It really, whatever works for you, essentially.
All right, perfect. Now, switching over to Rosemary and Jacquie, working with developers, working in developer advocacy. Something that we ask a lot of times in our meetups is the issue of, you know, running data on Kubernetes for beginners, right? So if you're dealing with whether it's a developer or a database engineer or someone DevOps, we can use all the different names we want to. If you're working with somebody in there who's going to be starting out, we can talk about the technical side. And I think those are important things. Before you start, make sure you've done X, Y, Z. It's probably good if you have experience with this. But also then there's the other side about mindset, about patience, about not getting too stressed out, about being kind to yourself, all this kind of stuff. From a podcast that we did a few weeks ago with somebody talking about the Strimsy operator, he said, be prepared for trial and error and don't be too hard on yourself when things don't work. From your perspective, though, as dev advocates, How do you see this? First of all, from, like I said, the technical side, or maybe we can even start with the mindset first and then how that can help with the technical side. Either one or both at the same time. I don't care.
As we both yell our opinions. I mean, so from what you're saying from a mindset, something that I guess this has kind of been my hill to die on this year is documentation doesn't always cover like, oh, I'm getting a phone call, we're going to turn that off. But documentation doesn't always cover like the proper beginner mindset. Like there's a lot of assumptions made, and it can be really, really hard to kind of jump into something, especially stateful sets in Kubernetes. As somebody that did that, there's all these rabbit holes you go down when you're learning. It's really easy to get frustrated and kind of be like, I don't know what's going on, and why don't I understand it? And I think we could do a lot of work as a community around improving that experience. From a technical standpoint, there's a lot of bells and whistles to learn going into it, especially if you're coming in, you're new, and maybe you've just learned Docker and you're still like kind of getting familiar with the point of, oh, I run Docker and I changed something and then it's not there. It's a pretty big jump from that level to Kubernetes itself and actually making sure the state stays there. Like, how are you managing your different volumes? Are they changing, etc.? Yeah, I think I could probably tangent more, but
no, tangent.
No, it's okay.
No, tangent.
Oh no.
Take it away. I insist.
Oh geez. Okay, well, I guess I referenced a little bit earlier that I come from a healthcare background, and I am in Canada. You're correct. So my stateful set experience with learning all these bells and whistles was that at the time we had asked if we could use some of their services, and the answer we got was, well, we cannot say for sure that the backup of your object storage will not go to an American facility, which violates all kinds of HIPAA rules around data residency.
Oh, this is good. We get data and politics, and particularly we're
control of your data. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is really, really good.
So this is kind of where my tangent starts. Is, well, we're a 3-person team supporting like 7 products. They all need healthcare compliance, and some of them are in Kubernetes, and some of them are in like data centers and VMs of various levels of management. So that's kind of how my team actually got into using Helm and Kubernetes was, well, we need these environments that we can keep control of our data, because we'd had a couple POC level, I think, environments that we'd set up where we couldn't have that control, or there was just other things with this goes back a bit into your previous question about like running it versus doing like a PaaS or a SaaS. We had some issues where like parts of our, I guess, database as a service, we couldn't control it to the point that we needed to, either to restrict it down or to open it to specific like specific hospital ports that needed to be able to communicate from a very specific one. Couldn't do it because that was on their end. And so kind of going down this rabbit hole of how do we learn how to do state? How do we, like, we had to do our own Postgres cluster was one of our asks for management. We're kind of like, none of us are Postgres experts. And having that kind of Helm chart and learning, all right, now that it does this, what kind of, like, how big does this need to be? Does it, like, how does it scale? How do we learn it? It was a really big rabbit hole, and it was really hard to learn between all of the different tools, the different deadlines, and the different specifics. And sometimes you'd run into problems like with Sentry. I'm almost done, I promise.
No, it's great.
No, I feel like I'm taking up so much time.
No.
With Sentry, we had this infamous problem that I think it took us about 12 weeks to solve, where we ran it as a Docker Compose and it worked, and we ran it as a VM and it worked. And we needed to get mobile, so Android, iOS, as well as web information for these healthcare apps. And we really specifically wanted for crash logs, and they would go into Sentry and then they would just kind of disappear. Like, we'd look in the logs and we'd see it was there. There was no errors. Everything seemed fine. You'd see the information come in and then it was just gone. And so this kind of comes back to state in that what had happened was the original person who had wrote it had taken the Docker Compose file and just kind of moved it over to the Helm chart. The problem here was that the Helm chart basically tried to multi-mount pods to the same volume. So it had multiple ones trying to write to the same volume, and it was just kind of silently failing in the background. It took 3 of us like 8 weeks to find because there was no errors anywhere. So it was just like, what's happening? And it's just, it can be a lot to learn state. It is difficult, it is hard, and it's hard to know when you've got it right. So yeah, I'm kind of going to stop now.
That was really, really good. And obviously as well too, is that we get into a certain story because of a technical element, and then you end up with international politics in the middle. And this is now playing out right now in Europe with Amazon's use of European data. There's this thing, the GDPR. All these issues are kind of going on right now. And so as much as people are having a, very technical approach to these things, like you said, we talk about mindset, and then we even have external factors such as legal factors. Right now, we have COVID factors that are influencing a lot of things. Rosemary, is there anything that you would like to add regarding how to approach running data on Kubernetes, stateful sets, and the mindset that's necessary to do so?
I think what Jacquie greatly summarized and explained is that all of business value is in data, right? Data is power. It doesn't matter what that data is. If it's a representation of your infrastructure estate, if it's a representation of the customers you have, if it's representative, name it, it is powerful. And there's a fear associated with working with something that could lose that much business value, right? If you do it wrong, you have compliance implications, you have legal implications, you have trust implications, whether it be shareholders or customers and the people who are using your tool. So I think the first thing is to say, take a step back. Are we looking at our data and hoarding it because it's special and we're worried we're going to lose value? And if that's the mindset, then it's really hard to tell someone, okay, let's try this new way of working with data. So then you start with this mindset of let's actually talk about what business value you're getting right now. And if the answer is not much, and you could be getting more out of it by changing the technical architectures of your systems, better processing it, making sure that it's better, it's more available. For example, if you're doing batch payments, you could shift to real-time payments. And that would perhaps, fix some of the problems you have with ledgers, batch jobs failing. And, are you going to get more business value by changing your technical architecture? If the answer is yes, then let's start to upskill and enable all of the ways that we can better manage that. So getting, at least whenever I've talked to, a number of stakeholders who are in charge of this data, the first question is oh no, what are we going to do? The second question is, okay, how much business value are you getting now? How much more will you get if we changed even some of the technical pieces and make it more available to you?
I think that's a really good point. And that's another thing that's a recurring element in these conversations that we have with lots of different folks is that as much as there's a lot of passion, a lot of interest in technology, don't have the business case, it's going to be pretty hard for this to go forward. In your particular case, Lili, what kind of business cases have you worked with, and what kind of business cases do you think we can anticipate in the future where running data on Kubernetes will make sense?
Sure. So I think in terms of business cases, it's like Rosemary said, it's if you don't need to, don't migrate, right? If it doesn't make your life easier, if it doesn't make more money, essentially, right? In the end, don't migrate. But if it does, and it if you can either just make things life easier for your SREs, they can focus on other things like observability or improving the tooling around your production. Please migrate to Kubernetes, migrate to various other things, but you don't have to migrate everything at once, right? I think that's the point. You don't have to migrate all your stateful or stateless applications, right? You can start with just migrating in your staging environment. You can start migrating just certain pieces. And I think that's the beauty of Kubernetes or container orchestration tools, is that you can just take some pieces out of it and you can make a business case with that, right? That you can make your staging faster or those kind of things, I think, is definitely the thing that I often say to people.
I think that's great. Is something we say in Spanish, siempre y cuando tiene sentido. If and always when it makes sense. Or another expression that we have from the United States, that if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. Just leave it alone.
Yeah, definitely.
And particularly, once again, like you said, this really sensitive issue of if we're going to move data, are we really sure what we're doing? What's the outcome? What's going to be the cost? Maybe it's going to be more expensive for us to move it than the value it's going to provide by having it in a different place. Tomasz, anything you would like to add about business cases?
Yeah, so basically, I will just stick, to my thesis that if you have cloud environment, that maybe your application is working fine, without having, you don't need to migrate something that just works. If it ain't broken, just don't fix it.
We have all this good colloquial folklore wisdom from those expressions.
Yeah. Yeah, but for many cases, if you, for example, if you just use cloud as only, you know, as a virtualization platform, like many companies do, then maybe it's time to move on with something more resilient, for example, because Kubernetes provides more resiliency, more reliability. And especially if you try it with private cloud, because you can't go with public cloud, and you tried, you know, setting up OpenStack, for example, which is horrible to set up and horrible to maintain, as far as I remember, then maybe it's time for you to try something else. And I would, you know, and I've seen many companies who decided to move on with Kubernetes, with, for example, OpenShift, which I really admire. And yeah, so for those companies who has, you know, some gap to fill, like they still use some virtual machines with some legacy storage, for example, then it's time for them to move on with something more modern, with cloud native approach, with Kubernetes. And I would suggest, you know, I would suggest them to start breaking things, to start trusting more, start trusting more with, you know, with this new approach, starting to check whether, you know, those applications will survive any outages or any crashes of hardware or anything that can break, actually.
Interesting that we have to be destructive to be constructive.
Yeah, I would recommend, you know, starting, you know, breaking things, because it is just very easy and very easy to test and very cheap to test, actually. So of course I would do it before actually going to production with those new applications, with those new stateful workloads.
Good. I mean, because that's something that's appeared in this conversation, is the idea of being battle tested. And when is something, what is our definition of battle tested? What does that mean? When can we say, okay, I think we're ready to go? Lili, in your experience, how has that been?
I think just use it, right? Like Tomasz said, like just run it, try it out, even in your cluster, right? I think the important is to have people just experience, right? I think having each of your, I don't know, developers, SREs have their own private cluster where they just try things out, just makes sense, right? Opening bugs, issues on repos and on the toolings you use is so important to just contribute to the projects that you use and just help resilience and help it be battle tested. I think that's so important for us, like for us, which we work on OpenShift, is that we always make sure, like we have a very specific process, but we also run our own stuff in a long-lived cluster. So to make sure that upgrades work and things like that. Besides that, we have like quality engineering and people like that. And you should take that approach in your own company, right? Just whether you're like Hashicorp or Red Hat, you should take that similar approach, I think, with your tooling as well.
Good. All right. Very, very good. And then to hear from Rosemary and Jacquie, this notion of battle testing, of playing around and breaking stuff, how do you approach that in Hashicorp? We'll start with Rosemary, so you don't have to decide.
Pick one.
Yeah,
so it will actually, it heavily depends on product. And as a developer advocate, I get my hands on mostly beta stuff. And that's where it starts to iterate, right? So, you know, they give it to usually the developer advocates first as a first go, just to either highlight some UX concerns or even some functional concerns, right? So there are some pretty common use cases we're very well aware of. And then each product, some products have very large integration suites where they're going to run it. Good example of this is Vault Kubernetes. They do a fantastic job checking into where it's running, how it's running, what happens when things go down. You know, with Terraform, even though there's like a kind of like the state portion of it is a little bit different in some regards, there's always some tests as to whether or not this backend works. And so there's a broad spectrum of functional tests as well as tests that are not perfectly chaotic in nature. I won't call it chaos, you know, some kind of chaos testing, because the reality is that it's supposed to highlight some things that, you know, from a production standpoint that you might not come across otherwise. But there's a certain amount of entropy that's introduced into the system so that we can understand in the broad spectrum of common use cases, whether or not it will be battle tested. They're also very modular in nature. So everything you add on is also tested individually. So overall, it will depend on product, and it will depend on the people who are coming to us and looking at the beta releases.
Once again, we got the tech side, we got the people side. Depending on the people that are going to be interacting with it, they'll have one strategy or approach or another. Jacquie, anything that you'd like to add on that in terms of battle testing?
Sure. In terms of battle testing, I guess in my past life as a DevOps engineer, which was really last year, but it feels like 10 years ago at this point, something that we tried really hard to read all the best practices, and we read all the things online about how do you do this and what do you do, but you don't get it right unless you talk to the people that are actually benefiting or using it, which it sounds pretty straightforward after the fact of, oh, you should talk to the people that are going to be using it. So your devs, how are they actually deploying their environments? Are they doing it in the same order you think they are? Are they cherry picking to different environments, et cetera, et cetera? Because we had this like pretty approach of like, hey, we'll do alpha, beta, and then UAT, and then prod. And it'll just go one to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's not actually what was happening, but we didn't know that because we weren't aware. So kind of there's one side of battle testing where you find all these things happening that you just didn't account for, or you didn't think of, or you didn't know to think of at the time. And then there's the other side of, okay, I think I'm doing it the right way, but what does the right way for them look like? Does this throw a wrench in their flow that we didn't know when we're just trying to help? From our position at Hashicorp, it's been interesting because like working on Nomad, I see a range of, well, really everything. So there'll be all kinds of clouds, there'll be all kinds of languages being used. It might be Windows, it might not be, it might be specialized Linux distributions I've never heard of until I saw this issue. And just kind of learning from the community, and again, our internal SRE and infra teams are also just great to learn from. But I guess my TLDR is no matter how much prep you do or how much reading or how far into it you go, there will always be something that comes up while you're battle testing or while you're deploying to prod, even though you've deployed this a million times somewhere else. So I think it comes back to our earlier point of be patient with yourself, be gentle, and be willing to learn from your mistakes and also admit them so that the rest of your team can kind of be open with that too.
I think that's a really good point, is that, expect the unexpected. No one's going to get it right in the first try. This is going to be a multi-step process. And it's interesting as well, too, because last week, 2 weeks ago, we did an interview with Tyler, who used to work at Percona and now is at Mozilla. And he was talking, it was interesting. I looked at his LinkedIn, and one of the first things he has a description of his personality based on Myers-Briggs personality test, but then also other things that he's done with StrengthsFinder, things like that. It's something that I've done in the past. But I think it's good, and I see this more in the tech community, in these kind of communities, perhaps than in other sectors. But that to be really, really upfront and open about that sort of stuff, because you may have a conflict with a team member or things like that, but it may be just because you have different ways of approaching problems, and particularly when we're talking not just from a team, let's say that everyone is from the same country, but particularly all of us are working in international environments. So people have different way of approaching problems in different countries and have different, we could say, communication styles in terms of how they address issues. I think that there's a lot to be said for that. So with that in mind, I want to ask kind of all of you is that once again, in terms of the personality that's going to be necessary to deal with, whether it's running stateful applications, how are these things dealt with in the companies that you work at? Can we start with you? How do you approach these issues in Red Hat, Lili?
Sure. So I think we try to approach it by working very closely with our SRE team, who actually run OpenShift dedicated. So they run OpenShift for customers. And I think it's important to just have working groups. It's important to have like common interests, and it's important to find those things. It's like, this is the same as in the open source, right? You're always going to have 100 personalities, and you're always going to have people who will just approach you thinking just because you do open source stuff, you have to fix this issue for them. So it's definitely like you meet a lot of personalities, and just knowing that you're all working towards the same goal, despite people approaching it in a different way, I think is the most important thing.
I think it's a very polite way of talking about how to deal with difficult people. That's very nice of you. No, because it's true is that when you're exposing yourself, some people get a real rush out of, attacking or being nitpicky or trying to make corrections or things like that. But I think there's a lot to be said for understanding this is just part of the process and to not take things so personally. I think
exactly.
And that's not easy. That's not easy when someone's sharing their code, when they're uploading something to a repository. They're kind of burying themselves to the world, and people can not really know what kind of background or baggage or things like that they might be bringing with them. So, like I said, I think a lot of what we try to do, at least in our community, is always guide people towards solutions, be kind when responding, take these things into account and not be so harsh. We're all supposed to be supposedly building things together and sharing things. And I think now more than ever in 2020 with the COVID situation, all these things, a little bit of solidarity, I think, goes a long way. That being said, shifting it more towards community practices. Tomasz, you've been involved in different communities related to Kubernetes and other ones. What are things that you feel make a successful community what it is?
Well, curiosity for sure, because communities are all about exchanging experiences, exchanging knowledge for sure. So, well, it's all about openness and curiosity. So these are the most important factors here. And but I want to also mention that curiosity is also very important when it comes to dealing with harsh situations, because I'm a learner, so my strength finder skill is learner. So for me, every opportunity to learn is something very precious, and it allows me and many people also this curiosity allow to learn something about themselves. Something about what actually happened, and not just go into this finger pointing mode. So that's really important, I think. And then it's also part of my my job, when it comes to community, to share this idea that it's we are just people. Everyone can make mistakes. Things happen, so it's all about learning.
I think it's a great point. Is that there are lots of learning experience that you can withdraw from any environment. I would definitely say I've learned much more from my failures in life than my successes, and that not so much to be obsessed with the result, but to focus on the process of how you get there. And there will be many twists and turns, and you'll learn things about coworkers, you'll learn things about yourself, and those are all things that are going to make you better at the end of the day. Now, with that in mind as well, too, dev advocates, I think a lot of what your work must be involved is in community building. What are strategies, apart from what we talked about already regarding curiosity and maybe some of these elements of patience, what other things would you add for any community out there that wants to be successful? And we'll start with Jacquie this time.
Oh, thinking. I've got so many things I want to answer to. Wow. I mean, like always, I think we've kind of touched on it, but always trying to be empathetic and sometimes working, I'm going to take a step back even further and say, I was the kind of contributor that was like really, really scared talking to people at conferences. I didn't want to get into speaking. It's just kind of a thing that ran away on me. And I was really scared of putting myself out there and kind of coming into this role as a developer advocate, where now you're working with the community and people are kind of approaching you often at the point that they're frustrated enough that they're reaching out of their inner circle, coming from that place of empathy and being willing to kind of figure out where the gaps are and listen to them, like really listen, is just so important. And it is really hard at a scale like ours, where I'm the DA focused on Nomad, so there's a lot of Nomad users, and a lot of times they're working at scales that I didn't work with. Like I've never worked at a Roblox level of scale where you have hundreds of millions of users. And just kind of trying to listen and fill those gaps in and make sure that they feel heard, but also make sure that that feedback makes it somewhere. Because if they feel heard, but then they don't see anything, like they don't see updates, or they don't get next steps, or they don't know how to proceed, it doesn't help as much as I'd like it to. So I think it's kind of like a big picture, trying to get past that frustration and figure out, how do I fit that together? How do I help them? And how do I kind of get them back on their way while taking back what I can for the team? sorry, I'll have one more thing to say and then I'm done on that. But I think the coolest thing I saw so far is again, it's an internal one, but I saw something our SREs were doing I thought was really cool. And I brought it to the developer team, kind of like hey, I found this. And they were like, I had no idea people were using it that way. Oh my gosh, have we done something that hurts like to use? Can we go fix that? And having more examples of that and being able to provide that direct feedback and then seeing our devs actually be enthusiastic to try and add that into the roadmap has just been, it's been kind of like a good incentive to keep getting that feedback, even though it's often uncomfortable and hard because I don't want them to be upset.
Yeah, but like you said,
I want to help.
sometimes, but even though there might be those moments, those in the moment, it might be difficult or uncomfortable. Later, those insights that you can get that then can be beneficial from other teams, like, hey, you just made this team's day. You know, like you just helped them get through this.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, once again, we go through this tech and this human stuff, is that the importance of empathy and being a good listener, which goes beyond just listening to someone talk and waiting for the finish so that you can respond. I think those are all very, very good points. Rosemary, is there anything that you'd like to add?
On that note, I'll probably say that if you want to build a community and it just like this one, which is amazing, you know, part of it is to never tell someone you're wrong. That's the worst thing that you could do when you're building a community is to tell someone you're wrong. And yes, it sounds terrible and sure, you know, why would, you know, there are things that maybe are very wrong, but the idea is that when you're in a community and you're building it up, the idea is to ask, okay, so what is this pattern you're using? What are the problems with it? And why won't it skip? It doesn't matter if it's, you know, if it's within your organization, it doesn't matter if it's something on a repository that's technical in nature. I think that one of the things that I learned from listening to open source users, but also starting communities, not even with a specific repository or a project in mind, is to always, you know, have the empathy and for the most part, never say that someone is wrong. Try to understand the context by which they're using it and why it works for them at that point in time. Because we've all learned and we've all gone through that kind of process. So I never say you're wrong to someone.
That's a really, really good lesson, to never say you're right. The thing is, there are so many other ways you can say that, is asking, well, what were the factors that contributed to you arriving to that conclusion? Also because, you know, right and wrong can always be very subjective. I think the bottom line here is, though, is that we're interacting with so many folks that have spent thousands of hours, thousands and thousands of hours on coding, on working on open source projects, on really getting into all this stuff. And then it's only fair that if empathy is a muscle, you know, how many thousands of hours have they spent, you know, exercising and working on it? And some people have arrived to different phases than other folks. But I think the main thing is really trying to keep that present. Like I always keep coming back to this, but as much as we're talking about a tech focus, you know, we have to keep in mind the human, the emotional, the psychological, the compatibilities, personality conflicts, all those things. Now we're getting close to the end. So this has been the State of State. It's been a fantastic, diverse conversation with lots of different stuff that we've been able to talk about. If you had to make, I'm going to give everybody, let's say 30 seconds to 1 minute, not an easy question. And if you want to abstain, that's totally fine. We'll start with you, Lili. In 1 year from now, all right, who knows how we'll be celebrating KubeCon in 2021? Well, I mean, we already have dates and things like that, but the way in which we'll be doing it, hopefully we can repeat this conversation. We can have round 2 of this, the State of State. Where do you see the State of State in 2021? What do you think is going to be developing? How do you think people are going to be approaching running stateful sets on Kubernetes? What do you think?
Well, hopefully it will be in Los Angeles, I think it was announced. So hopefully it's finally happening I actually miss conferences, which I didn't think I would say before. But yes, I think the main focus is to make the operators that run the stateful applications more resilient by either battle testing them more, to developing new operators, or even like taking the ones that exist and just making them better, essentially, like adding backup, those kind of things to the existing ones. I think that is the future, I think.
All right, so we're imagining being in Los Angeles, nice Southern California weather, and new and improved operators. All right, very good. Tomasz, what about you?
Well, I agree with Lili. I wish, you know, the next meeting or you know, more conferences, you know, next year, that they will be, you know, hosted somewhere on site rather than online. So basically, this is my wish. But yeah, so I wish, from 1 year from now that more people, will use Kubernetes. Especially those organizations who just are still, stuck with some legacy approach, legacy hardware maybe, and so on. So I wish they would just come up and start using containers and Kubernetes a lot, and stop being afraid of those new technologies.
This is a good point. A lot of what we encounter is fear and uncertainty. Where I live,
exactly.
What's funny is that we're starting to realize, because through this community of contacting lots of folks who I've worked with, that there are more and more people, many more people than it seems, that have been working with data on Kubernetes and have been doing so for a while. The tricky thing is that because, let's say, locally speaking here, if people don't see a major industrial company publicly stating that they're doing something like this, maybe it's only in their, their research and development area or something like that. It might seem a little bit more experimental, but what's so important about this community is that once we have these conversations, some people might say, oh gosh, like this is definitely not for me, or I couldn't do it, it goes over my head. We say, well, you've done this and you've done that, and you've worked with Hadoop and you've worked with Elastic, and you've even taken a look at some things in the operator world. I think you could, definitely make the migration. It's just, once again, a question of trial and error and patience. So I think that's a really, really good point that you're making. Rosemary, prediction for 2021, the state of state. What will we be talking about next year in November?
I think it will be balancing operator experience with security, right? So how do you ensure that the access management of that state is something that, you're enforcing on Kubernetes? Because we have more great features in 1.19 geared around state storage and improving the operator experience for that. But we also haven't really talked much about the security aspects, who's accessing it, where it's going, how is it encrypted, where, why, and how you ensure you audit it correctly. So I think we'll probably be talking about security.
This is a good point. And it's actually something that unfortunately we didn't touch on enough today. And we could obviously go, the security gives tons of material for lots and lots of conversations. And this issue of encryption, I think, is also super interesting as well. So that's a good point. I hope that for many companies and lots of folks out there, we don't wait until November to have conversations about security, because it's often the thing that gets put off until the very, very end. It's like, no, we actually probably need that in the very, very beginning. When we're talking about best practices, when we're talking about culture, when we're talking about mindset, when we're talking about breaking things, in which context, in which environment, who has access to what, these are all very, very good questions. And last but not least, Jacquie, November 2021, what is going to be the state of state?
There's unmute. Okay. I think, as everyone knows, this year's been a really different year. It's shook up a lot of how people work and how we collaborate. And I think that there's a lot of discussion around how infrastructure and technical lines tend to mirror your organizational lines. So I'm really interested in seeing what comes up next year around these new or shifted organizational lines. Now that you're not sitting in the same row with your team and you're like, it's all, across the internet or calls, is it more inclusive or is it more siloed? How does that kind of reflect in the future? And I think like what Rosemary had to say about security is going to tie a lot into that, because now you can't do things like, hey, I'm just going to whitelist the office IP, right? You need more robust security controls and ways of accessing and auditing that. So last year, there was a lot of discussion on state and user experience, and I think it's only natural that next year there'll be security. So we'll see how that goes.
This is a good point. That we want to encourage freedom. We want things to be horizontal, but at the same time, we need visibility when we're talking about auto discovery and microservices, things that can go on, whether it's with orchestrators, sidecars, et cetera. There are lots and lots of what ifs. And sometimes, security people are in the business of security. So the more fear you have, the more money they make. But there's a lot of good reasons behind a lot of these arguments, and I think they do need to be taken seriously. That being said, we are reaching the end. This has been a super cool conversation. We always have with us our graphic recorder, who is Angel. Angel, can you say hello? I will ask you to unmute. So anyway, while we've been talking, a very talented artist has been drawing the conversation. David, puedes cambiar la pantalla. So if you can see my screen, can everybody see my screen? So here we have a visual summary of some of the different things that we've been talking about. Angel has to work very, very hard while we're doing this. And another thing that we didn't get to as well is obviously, many people here speak more than one language. So for Angel, English is not his first language. So he's been deciphering everything that's been talked about. I've been giving him a couple of tips and hints. But it's something that we always like to give as a present to our fantastic panelists, our fantastic guests here in Data on Kubernetes. So I will be sending that to you via email so we can continue the conversation. It's always a nice way to sort of wrap up and have a visual representation of, we talked about a lot of stuff. So anyway, that being said, I want to thank you all very, very much for your time. As I said in the beginning, very happy that from now on, with every Data on Kubernetes meetup we're going to be doing, we will be donating to a different NGO. And today will be Code 2040. Like I said, helps increase diversity in the United States for the different profiles of people who are involved in coding. I'm sure we're all going to be enjoying all the things that will be going on in KubeCon in the next few days. We'll have all this uploaded to YouTube probably by the end of today, and the podcast probably later on this week. So thank you all very, very much to our panelists, to Tomasz, to Lili, to Jacquie, and to Rosemary. My name is Bart. If you want to get a t-shirt, hit me up on Slack. Thank you all very, very much. Take care.